And that's one of the things about religion that we have to remember when we're talking about that makes it such a hot topic issue is because we're talking about law. Who gets to be God? Who gets to be God's deputies? Who is the Most High? Who is the divine authority? It's all about the claim to the Most High. The only way that somebody can be higher than us is if we give away our power. Because there's nobody, we're all equal. But we're not equal in our knowledge, so ultimately I think it does have to be a hierarchy, but it has to be a cooperative hierarchy like a bee colony. It's about what our value system is, what we care about.
Hello and welcome, all like minds and spirits, to episode 3 of the CubbyWhole Podcast, where critical, important topics are unveiled, discussed, and tested. Our website is CubbyWhole.com, that's CubbyWhole.com. It is April 20th, 2020, and today we will be finishing up on the topics from our last show, which include the Trivium and Quadrivium, the truth discovery methodologies, and then continuing into consciousness and cymatics. Unfortunately, Nate cannot join us today, so I will be hosting solo on these topics. I want to give a quick update for the listeners about the S.E.E.D for Growth Conference. Unfortunately, due to this medical tyranny lockdown from these authoritarian elite overlords, my location host has informed me that we will not be able to hold the conference at the end of May at that location. So, what I have decided is to postpone the event, and all the details of the event will be updated on the CubbyWhole website and on the Eventbrite website also. If you're interested in getting a refund for your ticket, that is no issue whatsoever. Just get on the Eventbrite page and go through the process of getting your refund, and I'll get that out to you immediately. But we are asking people to actually hold their tickets until the future date, because we will be holding this event no matter what. And as far as the information that I've received from all the speakers, it looks like everybody is still on board for coming and speaking at the next event. Now, the timing of this event is still unknown, but I will be sending out mass emails to all those who have bought tickets, and we will continue to advertise, especially as we get closer to the event. I also will be making more public announcements on future episodes of this podcast and on social media networks. So getting right into today's episode, what we had covered on the previous episode was the truth discovery methodologies, which are the Trivium and the Quadrivium. Just to briefly recap over these, the Trivium is the 3 roads, and it's input, processing, and output, or grammar, logic, rhetoric, or knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And then the Quadrivium is the 4 roads to truth, the 4-fold path to truth, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Both of these combined make up the 7 liberal arts, and these are the most crucial tools that we have at our disposal to actually discover truth for ourselves, to discern falsehood from what is true. And this also falls under the realm of epistemology and what the justifications for truth and knowledge are. One good allegory for this that I didn't get to mention last week is Plato's allegory of the cave, which you can find a lot of correlations in a lot of other Greek mythologies and things like that to Plato's allegory of the cave. But this is one great example of breaking through the illusions of deceit and your own illusions of what you think is real compared to actually what reality really is and what truth actually is. So Plato has Socrates describe a group of people who have lived chained to a wall of a cave for all their lives, facing a blank wall. The people watch the shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of the fire behind them and give names to these shadows. And this is the illusions, the shadows, and they actually start to identify with these shadows as real. So, they start to think that that is all there is to reality. That is the limited perception that they have. So this goes along with our truth versus perception talk that we were speaking on last week as well. And eventually one of these prisoners gets freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall were not reality at all, though they were a part of reality, but they are not the totality of everything. But metaphorically, we could just look at the shadows as the illusionary constructs of the mind. And he goes out and sees the light. And the first time he sees the light, he or she sees the light, it actually blinds them, because it can be very harmful to come into contact with the truth when you first are seeing or hearing it, So that's something we were talking about last week also, is that truth can be belligerent, and is belligerent in a way, because it is waging war against illusions and mind control. So that person tries to come back in to free the other prisoners within the cave and show them that the manufactured reality, that is the shadows that the prisoners see, is not the entire truth, and that's not reality, and it's not exactly what they are perceiving. And most of these people in the cave look at him and ostracize him and scrutinize him, and are very rigidly skeptical against what this person has to say. And actually, probably taken to an extreme level, they fight against that truth that he's trying to bring in, that he's trying to enlighten them and free them from these chains, because they're so egally identified and have been so programmed and conditioned to believe that that's all there is to reality. So I think that's a great allegory for looking at what the truth is and how we come into contact with what the truth is, or truth discovery, how we discover the truth. So we're trying to free our minds, and we're trying to use these tools such as the Trivium and Quadrivium to get out of that prison of the mind and actually come into the light of true knowledge and of reality. That's what we're trying to do with this podcast also. It's what we try to do with the conference and with our presentations. It's trying to awaken these people who are prisoners in their own mind and actually physical reality to these illusionary shadow constructs that they have believed in wholeheartedly, that is the reality of everything. And I mean, this makes people docile and makes people just want to accept things just as they are. And there's a form of fear that comes in with actually coming out of that cave and coming out of that prison, because it means self-responsibility. So there's a lot of emotions that come up when you approach somebody with the truth that their entire reality is not what they think it actually is. This can be a form of gaslighting. It can be taken in positive and negative ways, for like dark sorcery or manipulation, people who want to manipulate people. You can actually gaslight somebody into confusing them about what reality is by making them think that the illusion is what is real rather than the truth. So, I just wanted to add that in there, that there is a negative side that this can be used in a form of manipulation towards people, that you can actually, try to convince people in the illusion rather than the actual truth. But what we're trying to do here is convince people of the actual truth. And it's their responsibility ultimately to come into contact with that. It's their responsibility that they have to, choose to actually want to look for the truth. So one thing in theosophy, which we can get into in the future, one of their main motifs is that there's no religion higher than truth. Truth is the highest of the high when we get into it. And a quote by Gerald Massey is that they must find it difficult, those who have taken authority as truth rather than truth as authority. And I think that's what we're seeing today, is that a lot of people take the physical man's authority, the belief, the dogma in the authority of man as the truth, as the objective truth, and even, relative truth on both sides, depending on your ideology there, as, the real thing. And that's not what it actually is. The truth is the only real authority in the universe. And the truth is obviously based in objectiveness, no matter what people might perceive it as. One thing I like to bring up is presuppositionals, which is the idea when someone says that there's no such thing as truth, well, is it true that there's no such thing as truth? If it is, then obviously there is such a thing as truth, and it contradicts what they're stating. And if it isn't, then there's obviously such a thing as truth also. So both answers there come back to truth. But to kind of get back into what I was saying, just to give people a little bit more knowledge about epistemology, the word epistemology comes from Greek, and it's episteme, which means knowledge, and an ology is the study of, so it's the study of knowledge, the theory or study of the nature or grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits, validity, and its scope. So this really helps people to get out of the solipsistic mindset when you start to study philosophy, and epistemology is one of the base things in philosophy. You have metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and we'll be covering all of these. And this is one allegory that really helps you to deal with the ideas of epistemology, and helps you to deal with in your own mind, and helps you to deal with your own ego and your own illusions that you may have built up or may have been programmed with. But other than that, I think the best way to state it is that truth is simple. It is simply that which is, and we could never reiterate that enough. We need to really make truth, the definition of truth, such that a child can understand it. It doesn't need to be taken into some totality of God's knowledge or anything like that. It needs to be a base, foundational methodology for how we come to understand reality. And I think that's one problem that people have, is that they think of the truth as some kind of such a grand thing that there's no way you can ever come to understand that. I'm not saying that you can come to know all things, but you can come to understand that which is, or you can understand what truth is. If we were to understand all things at all times and all places, that would literally be the mind of God. And our biggest lesson here is to learn that we are not God. We are a component to the aspects of God, if you want to look at it that way. We are a portion of that tapestry, that big divine piece of the universe, or of existence, of reality, however you want to put that, of nature. One of the things that we've done is balkanize epistemology. And we've broken it down into such fine aspects, to such little pieces. It's like taking a mirror and shattering it, and then trying to put all those pieces back together. It's not easy to do that when you start to make things complicated. So to make it simple really helps with the mind. And hey, it goes along with what we're trying to do here with the podcast. It's holistic. We can't fully scope all channels of perception all at once, or all channels of consciousness all at one time. That would be having your radio tuned into every single channel that there is out there and trying to make sense of every single channel. You can't do that. You have to tune into that frequency and then make use of that perception of that frequency, and filter through that with the truth methodology, discovery method, the Trivium and the Quadrivium, and then you come together with other people, or you find a different channel. You tune into another channel. So it's trying to scope full 360 of something, maybe even in a toroidal aspect as well, like a three-dimensional 360, like a sphere, and then trying to find out what that thing is that you're looking at from all angles. But you can't know all angles of that all at one time. And that's a big thing that I think people get confused, is that they're thinking that they can know everything. That's what I mean by the totality of the truth. You can't know all that all at one time. So the radio example is really good. But to kind of continue on here, I think the great little quote from the Oracle at Delphi: "Heed these words, you who wish to probe the depths of nature. If you do not find within yourself that which you seek, neither will you find it outside. If you ignore the wonders of your own house, how do you expect to find other wonders? In you is hidden the treasure of treasures. Know thyself, and you will know the universe and the gods." And I think that's a very profound and accurate statement, because this is about knowing the self, the capital S self, which we'll break down in the future, the higher self. And it is about coming in contact with that inner treasure and opening that chest, within yourself, and having the heart-based consciousness, which we can talk about a lot in the future. I'm sure Nate has a lot to say about the heart-based consciousness because it correlates to imagination a lot. Nate and I will definitely be breaking down imagination in a future episode. There's no doubt that our imaginations have been pretty much destroyed at a collective level, and this is done for the purpose of keeping the minds incapable of imagining a different condition to be manifested in our world today. But from here, I'd like to go ahead and explain some things about the difference with esoteric knowledge compared to exoteric knowledge. Let's first break down the words. Exoteric comes from the Greek adjective exoterikos, which means external or outside of. We could look at a working definition for this as exoteric knowledge is intended for or likely to be understood by the general public, current or popular among the general public. So this is knowledge that most people have and utilize in their daily life. Esoteric knowledge comes from the Greek adjective esoterikos, which means within or inside. Esoteric knowledge is intended for or likely to be understood by only a small number of people with specialized knowledge or interest, hidden, mysterious, beyond the range of ordinary knowledge, experience, or perception, that which is communicated only to the initiated. And I would also like to add in that a lot of people think that esoteric knowledge is deliberately hidden, but it's not. Esoteric does not mean deliberately hidden. It just means that it is knowledge not widely known to the general public. So that's one thing that we do need to make clear, because I always hear this in, the New Age communities and things like that. Esoteric knowledge is deliberately hidden, but it's not. The only true way to get to the center of the dartboard and to understand truth is by the cultivation of the heart-based intelligence. And this actually means doing due diligence into the esoteric studies and occult knowledge. This is because we have to have enough care to actually want to discover the truth for ourselves. It is the first principle, and principle literally means that which comes first, and the truth is that which comes first. For most people today, they are living in the world without ever coming into true understanding of how crucial the truth actually is. It is like living in a library and never touching the books in that library. This reminds me of the movie Doctor Strange, where he recognizes that the most valuable knowledge is locked up tight. And if it wasn't for him actually getting into those books and dabbling in them, then he wouldn't have the knowledge that is needed to understand what was actually taking place, and thus he wouldn't have been able to actually save the day. That is the equivalent of the esoteric knowledge that is needed to make a change in ourselves and in the world. So this is about raising our consciousness, which leads me into our next topic. What is consciousness? One way we can look at consciousness is that it is usually generalized as characteristics comprised of, qualities such as self-awareness, sentience, sapience, and the ability to perceive a relationship with oneself and one's environment. So one thing that I like to explain to people is just imagine a circle, and then you put, self inside that circle. Let's just put that circle dot. Let's bring the circle dot into it. That dot represents the self, and it's inside of that circle. And then that self then self-reflects, and now it has become dual. So now you create a vesica Pisces. You have another circle that happens. So instantly, as soon as it becomes self-aware, it goes into duality, and it goes into consciousness, where it's now reflecting about what it is, who it is, what's going on in the environment, in the internal realm, and then this also reflects into the external realm. So, that's a really basic way of looking at like how we become dualistic in our consciousness and how we become conscious itself. You can't be conscious without reflection of certain characteristics, whether internal or external. So you cannot have consciousness without becoming conscious of something. So it is the ability to perceive, a relationship between oneself, whether internal, and oneself externally. So it's the ability of a being to recognize patterns. This is also another thing, because consciousness is about correlative thinking. It's about finding patterns, ubiquity within the self-awareness and the awareness of the environment. So it's looking for patterns. We are looking for patterns and meaning with respect to events taking place both within ourselves in the realm which the self exists and operates in. So that's a big part of consciousness. And I think a great book for people to look into to check out some deeper aspects of consciousness is Esotericism and Symbol by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. And he really breaks down some of the fundamental aspects of consciousness. And I will give just a little read from his book here, from chapter 5, page 15. And I'm not going to get deeply into it, but just read a little quote from him. And he says, fundamentally, consciousness has two aspects. One is the result of comparison, the other of identification. Both aspects need to be inscribed. One is organic or cerebral inscription, and the other is vital or functional. So what he's talking about here is that there's an innate consciousness within us, something that is intrinsic and innate within the being, and it is something that is not birthed from the biology of the being, that the biology is just simply the antenna to tune into that. And then there's another aspect of consciousness, which is something that is coming as a result from that source signal and from the biology being able to actually interpret that signal. So there's these two aspects to consciousness. And if you really read this chapter in the book, chapter 5, page 15, he really breaks that down. And I think that's a very good place to start for people to really understand the aspects, because in modern science we have the idea that consciousness is generated from the brain, and in my point of view and in the studies that I've seen, consciousness does not generate from the brain. It is an external source, and the brain is simply the antenna to pick up on that. The study of consciousness is probably going to be infinite, because consciousness itself is infinite in my point of view. So consciousness is the reality engine. It is the source of all that we see and that we are aware of. And I would recommend people to actually study quantum mechanics, especially the double slit experiment, to understand a little bit more about how consciousness works and how the wave function collapses when it becomes observed. Let's take another look here at another concept from consciousness. Ideas that are in the minds of men, right? Well, let's look at the definition of idea. Idea means archetype, or a concept of the thing in the mind of God. Now pay very close attention to that. It is a concept of a thing in the mind of God, is what the literal definition says when you look it up. But I find it very interesting also that it is an archetype, and the universe speaks to us in archetype symbolism, or you could say God speaks to us in symbolism. Some other definitions you may find for idea is form, the look of a thing, a kind, sort, nature, mode, fashion. So ideas are archetypal thought forms that are created from the collective mind or source consciousness. And it makes complete sense to me that it is an archetypal form coming from, the totality of consciousness or source, or if you feel comfortable using the word God, I completely have no issues using that word either. But I think, we all must become self-aware. And this goes back to that allegory of the cave as well. Self-awareness is the key to being able to find the truth as well. Without self-awareness, you're going to be breeding in more illusions, and you're going to be cut off to a certain degree. You're not going to be tuning into the right channels to be able to listen to the source consciousness. And that's a big thing that a lot of people get stuck in, is the static. They get stuck in that static state of consciousness. And that can be a very detrimental place, especially when we're trying to make a better world and also build better selves to actually create that better world. But the brain is so complex, we really don't know exactly how it all works, and maybe we will never know how it all works. But the main part that I just want to hammer on is that it's not the main thing that creates consciousness. It does not generate consciousness. It picks up on the source. I would highly recommend Bruce Lipton's work in this area to understand this more. He is a epigenetic biologist that really helps to break these things down in a very scientific and peer-reviewed manner. So all his work is peer-reviewed, and it's all evidence-based. And he has a book called The Biology of Belief, which is really, really profound, and I would recommend that to anybody that is interested in studying this more in-depthly. So what needs to take place for a true paradigm shift is a realization of the true self. And this is directly related to becoming conscious of our modalities of thinking, feeling, and behaving. All knowledge really worth understanding is contained within the self and the environment in which the self operates in. The knowledge that is actually going to get us out of the cesspool that we have trapped ourselves in as a species is knowledge of natural law and the self. And this has to do with who we ultimately are and our value as spiritual beings here on this plane of existence. Why is this knowledge of critical importance? Because it gets us to the root causal factors of how we created the condition that we are in. One of the requirements to help end the suffering here on earth is that we need the ability, the tools at our disposal, for us to be able to discern between falsehood and the truth. This is why we started out with the Trivium and Quadrivium on this podcast. Now, understanding the brain functionality and consciousness correlates to how we discover truth. But to kind of move forward here into the discussion, we're just going to cover the basic brain functions. We're not getting into the complete neurology and the study of, how the complete brain works. But to understand the basic brain functions is really important, because it is about correlating archetypal knowledge, and it's about understanding yourself. One of the things I want to say here is that the human brain is probably, and definitely to me, the most powerful computer, and it's known to process about 1 billion neurons, and about 1 quadrillion connections known as synapses are stored within it. And the brain's storage capacity alone is about 100 terabytes to 2.5 petabytes, which is just completely beyond. And this is just from modern studies, so, I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually well beyond all this. And this is just what we're finding out today. So it can process about 400 billion bits of information a second. That is so fast, So the brain is such a powerful and sacred instrument. And this is why we need to keep our brains healthy, because if your brain becomes unhealthy, if it's filled with toxins, if it's flooded with fluoride or anything that can actually damage the glands in the brain, or damage the synapses, or damage the ability for the neurons to travel, you're not going to be able to think properly. So a lot of the issues that we face today, I think, is from actually some physical brain damage that's happened to us over a long period of time, and also from, just this lifestyle. So trauma really can damage the brain. Any type of trauma, and we can get into trauma stuff in the future, but trauma will actually make the brain not function as well as it should. Now you can overcome that, obviously, because of something known as neuroplasticity, which the brain can rewrite itself. And that's actually a book, The Brain That Rewrites Itself, which is really good. We have the cerebrum, which is the one of the largest parts of the brain. And it contains the cerebral cortex, consisting of two hemispheres. And these are separated by a fissure, a main fissure between the two hemispheres. It holds many subcortical structures as well. And like I was saying, the brain health plays a critical role in human thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So it's extremely important for us to become familiar with the basic brain structures. But like Nate was talking about earlier, we have a triune aspect of the brain. We have three basic sections of the brain. So we'll start out with the lowest section, which is the oldest section in the brain, which is the brain stem, also known as the R complex or the cerebellum. And that means in Latin little brain. So they correlated this to the small brain, which I felt was very interesting, and you'll see why here later on. So this region of the brain is the oldest in evolution and controls basic things like motor functions, respiratory, minor cognition, and basically, just things like survival mechanics, fight or flight, and it is mostly connected to the left brain hemisphere. The reason why they call it the reptilian brain is because there are no real emotions and not many clear and comprehensible intellectual thoughts. There are thoughts coming from this, like Nate was talking about, but to be able to recognize those, it's very basic. It's very basic thoughts. It's primordial thoughts, It's just about survival, like I was talking about. So the next section of the brain is the limbic system of the brain. And this is the mammalian brain. And as you can see, these are correlated to different, categories of species in nature, and there's a reason for this, because these species are actually using those parts of the brain more actively than others. But to continue on to the next section of the brain, it is called the limbic brain or the mammalian brain, and this really makes possible the emotional responses in beings with the capacity for this, beings that have the access to the mammalian part of the brain. This also makes possible for long-term memories, learning, and motivation. It produces medium cognitive abilities. So the limbic system is where the subcortical structures meet the cerebral cortex. It is connected mostly to the right brain hemisphere. And these are very important to understand, that the R complex is connected mostly to the left brain, and the limbic system is connected mostly to the right brain hemisphere. Now, this is also where you have the pituitary gland. This is also where you have the pineal gland. Now, most of us have heard of the pineal gland, also known as the third eye. It regulates circadian rhythm, or your sleep cycles. It also is a producer of DMT, and it is known as the seat of the soul. It is a small pine cone shaped unilateral gland in the body. It's one of the only unilateral glands in the body, whereas most of the other ones are bisymmetrical. There cannot be enough emphasis on how important the pineal gland is, especially when awakening oneself to a higher state of vibration or consciousness. But we also have the hypothalamus that is located in this region near the pituitary gland. Now, I find that the pituitary gland is very interesting. It is known as the master gland, and it regulates mostly all hormone functions, and it helps to control things like blood pressure, the growth hormones, even like the functions of the sex organs. It helps to regulate the thyroid glands and actually all the other glands, thus why it's called the master gland. It helps to regulate metabolism. It helps with the female anatomy and pregnancy, nursing. It is one of the major factors in the endocrine system, and it helps with things like pain relief through endorphins. So it is the controller of all the other glands in the body through hormone production, which is obviously why they call it the master gland. But I also find it interesting that they named it pituitary, and the puta comes from the Egyptian word Ptah, P-T-A-H. And this shows how advanced the Egyptians were in their understanding of the anatomy of the brain. They obviously did have a very in-depth knowledge of how we function. And this is why we're going to continuously see a lot of these correspondences between how much of the Egyptian sciences relate to the sciences of modern day. But that's just one example. But Ptah was known as the alchemist, and it makes sense being that he's the master gland, because he is the one who deals with all the chemical production into the body. Ptah was also known as the craftsman, or the god of craftsmen, or craftsmanship. So this also relates to alchemy, but it also relates back to Freemasonry, which we will break down in future episodes. If we take a little look at his mythology here, Ptah is said to conceive the world by the thought of his heart and gives life through the magic of his word. So I feel that that's very important because it has to do with the heart-based consciousness, what we were talking about earlier. And the pituitary is about emotions. The limbic system is about the emotional spectrum of the human being. And Ptah was the alchemist of all of the chemicals that created those. And words are also a feminine attribute. They are a feminine characteristic. They can be associated to the feminine nature of reality because they're waves, they're frequencies. So the left brain is associated with the masculine component, whereas the right brain is associated with the feminine component. But if we also take a look at the triune brain, we can look at it this way, that the R complex is associated to the masculine component, which is mostly connected to the left brain, and then the limbic system is associated with the feminine component because it's about emotions, which is mostly connected to the right brain. But the next section of the brain is the neocortex, or the telencephalon is what it's called. And this in Latin means new. So this is the new cortex. Neo means new, which can be correlated to Neo from the Matrix. And Neo is also an anagram for the word one. So this does have to do with unity consciousness. And there's a lot more we can break down about the movie The Matrix, which is an amazing allegory. And I'm sure that most people who are listening are very familiar with this movie. It also means bark or new rend. It means the new cortex or new bark or new rend of the brain. The neocortex of the brain has two hemispheres, the left and the right, which is separated by a unilateral fissure down the middle of the gray matter of the brain. This part of the brain is what makes us human. So it largely facilitates higher order thought functions, and it gives us our maximum cognitive abilities. It is what separates us from the animal kingdom by giving us the functions such as logic, reason, high in-depth language capability. It allows us to do art. It allows us to create music. And it gives us our ability of conscience when it is in proper working order. Let's take a look at the etymological definition of conscience here. So conscience comes from Latin, the prefix con, meaning together, and sciere, which means to know. So it is in context of having knowledge. It's not just a gut or feeling. It is literal knowledge. And what is that knowledge of? It is the awareness of your actions being either correct, moral, or incorrect and immoral. So it is the ability to discern right action from wrong action. But it goes a little bit further than this. It is common sense knowledge between right action and wrong action. So the neocortex is what allows us to have the capacity to understand morality and the difference between what a right is and what it is not. I like to correlate the brain's functionality to Star Trek, specifically Next Generation, because that's one of my favorites personally. If we take a look at how the spaceship runs, the Enterprise functions, you have the engineer section, at the base of the ship, which is where the warp core resides. This is the R complex of the brain. This is what makes movement possible in the spaceship, and also what makes movement possible in the human body. Then as we move up to the midsection of the ship, this will be correlated to the limbic system, which is where you find lodging, the cafeteria, recreation, but also where study takes place, where people are reading and processing all the information that they have been taking in. And then one step further, we have the highest level, which is the neocortex, which I correlate to the bridge of the ship, which is where all the functions come together to actually make up the human being or the enterprise. So this is where the higher level order thinking is taking place. This is where all the main functional crew members come together to cooperate to execute their mission and their journey. So the bridge is correlated to the neocortex. Let's say that we are attacked and the damage is located in the bridge of the spaceship. Well, then the functionalities of the spaceship revert back to more primitive or lower level sections of the ship. So this means that the functions might revert back into the engineer compartment or the reptilian compartment of the brain. So if our neocortex is damaged, our command function station will revert back to our basic survival instincts, being that of the R complex or the cerebellum. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a blunt force trauma to the bridge or the neocortex. It can just be an imbalance within the hemispheres of the brain. There are all sorts of weapons that are being waged against our brain and our biology daily. From the chemicals in the food, the water, the air, and even including radionic fields that are affecting the physiology of the being. This is how they destabilize the neocortex to put us in a survival mode. We are much more easy to control when we are in our animal modes of consciousness. So if we are in our limbic system of our brain or our cerebellum, the reptilian system of the brain, the mammalian or the reptilian, we can be controlled like herd animals. To understand more about how these weapons of manipulation affect our physiology, we have to take a look at the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere of the neocortex. So the left side of the neocortex mostly facilitates analytical thought, logic, linear thoughts. It is associated to the yang energy. It is associated also with solar and matter, and this is directly because it is a masculine component of our consciousness. So it is the masculine side of our brain, and that's because of its functionalities, being it thinks in linear modes, or it facilitates linear thought process. So that's about straight lines. So this is just a simple way that we can look at it. And straight lines are a masculine component, archetypally. So that's why it is a masculine part of our consciousness. And it is not a coincidence that our brain evolved and developed this way. It is based off of the cymatic frequencies that are directing and governing the way our biology is taking form. We can associate this to the equilateral upward facing triangle, which we could call the blade. And that's also a masculine component because it is about piercing or thrusting. The right brain facilitates things like creativity, the emotions, intuitive thought processes. So in contrast to the left brain being matter, we have the right brain being connected to the spirit. It is symbolically associated with lunar aspects of our consciousness. And this is because the moon is associated to feminine aspects. Mostly the reason why is because of how the moon affects the menstrual cycle of the females, and also how it affects the emotional sides of our consciousness. Since emotions are associated with the feminine, we can correspond this to the lunar aspects also, in contrast to the solar aspects, which is a more active attribute. So the left brain being associated with the sun has to do with it being more active, which is symbolically related to the sun. The left brain is the sacred masculine component of our consciousness, whereas the right brain is the sacred feminine components of our consciousness. Since the left brain has to do with activity, it is associated to self-defense also, which is one of the pillars of enlightenment. There are two pillars of enlightenment. One is the non-violent pillar, which is associated to the right brain, and the other is the self-defense pillar, which is associated to the left brain. One cannot consider themselves to be an enlightened being if they do not have enough self-care and self-respect to defend themselves. Self-defense is one of nature's oldest laws, and we ought not forget that. But going back to the right brain, it is also the yin energy. So we have the yin and the yang. And if you look at the yin-yang, the two dots on the yin-yang are a bird's eye view of these two pillars of consciousness. Obviously, it is supposed to represent a little bit of the light within the dark and a little bit of the dark within the light. And I completely agree with that association. And that is how our brain works too. There's a little bit of feminine within our left brain and a little bit of masculine within our right. So this is all just basic generalization when it comes to these correspondences within the brain. But without this understanding of how the brain works, we lack the knowledge and the understanding that's necessary to heighten ourselves and to create better things in reality. And we won't understand the issues that come about when we're in an imbalance, whether it be a chronic right brain imbalance or a chronic left brain imbalance. So the left brain tends to be more aggressive, the right brain tends to be more passive. The right brain is also symbolically associated to the inverted equilateral triangle, which we could call the chalice, because it is an open womb, or it is about openness. So the left brain is the assertive part of our consciousness, and the right brain helps us to take in information and assimilate information, to absorb, to be listeners rather than speakers. But like I was saying, it is of no coincidence that the left and right brain took form this way. Now these are both interconnected through the corpus callosum, which is the great mediator. And if there is a imbalance between the left and the right parts of our neocortex, then we fall into what we could term master think or slave think. So if a human being's left hemisphere becomes chronically dominant, the R complex of the brain will become the executive function of the brain. Emotions will become suppressed, and the person will become ruled by selfishness, egoism, base desires, survival, and developed a personality based in domination and control. And in contrast to that, if the right brain becomes dominant, if a human being's right brain hemisphere becomes chronically dominant, the limbic system will take over executive function of the brain. Defense and survival instincts will become suppressed, and the person will be ruled by their emotions and develop a personality based in submissiveness and naivete. a good example of this is Stockholm Syndrome. A person in Stockholm Syndrome is in the slave think, is in a imbalance within the hemispheres of the brain, which means that they are chronically within the right brain, and the left brain activities are being neglected and probably even atrophied because they've been in it for so long. So the corpus callosum helps the information to travel back and forth between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and that's why it's called the great mediator. It is the bridging of the brain. And there's some symbolic knowledge to that also. If you look into Freemasonry, we can understand how important the archway is, or the bridge is, in Freemasonry. And we understand that one of the strongest structures is the arch, where two sides lean against each other, and then we have the keystone in the middle. So in trauma-based mind control techniques, one thing that they target is the corpus callosum. If they can damage the corpus callosum, then they can damage the ability to balance the left brain and the right brain together. And that's what we're trying to bring in. We're trying to bring in a state of non-duality between the sacred masculine and sacred feminine components of our consciousness. Unfortunately, most people have an internal schism or battle going on between the way they think and the way they feel. They think one thing and they feel the exact opposite, or they feel one thing and they think the exact opposite. That is the sure sign that you have an imbalance going on. And it is our job to become conscious of that imbalance and to align our thoughts and emotions together to create the divine action, to create a healthier action, or a more productive and moral action with our bodies on this plane of existence. Because what this really comes down to is that if we have a destabilized neocortex, we are less likely to create moral actions in society. And freedom and morality are directly proportional to each other. So the law of freedom is that as morality increases in any given society, freedom increases, and as morality declines in any given society, freedom declines. Now that's at the aggregate level of those societies. So as more actions that are manifested in a society destroy freedom, as more immoral actions are manifested, then there is less freedom in that society. And as there is less immoral actions manifested in a society, then there is more freedom. We can get into that here in the future because I know we're running out of time here. But just to re-emphasize on that a little bit, moving towards either extreme of either polarities of intellect or emotions can be a divisive force which holds us back from true care and right action. So we must engage our will and, really use the willpower to unite these polarizing forces. So we need knowledge, courage, willpower, and right action, in addition to true care, to really, make a change. And when this happens, when these parts become equally balanced to the best of our ability, we will get a higher state of consciousness, and that will reflect into the universe fractally also. We can correlate this to the Holy Trinity also. But the reptilian section of the brain can be related to the Father, and then the limbic system can be related to the Holy Spirit or the Mother, the sacred feminine, and then the neocortex can be the divine offspring, the divine child or son from that. So that's just another triune aspect of how we can look at this symbolically. And I feel that's really important when we're looking at, these threes and and also looking at the way consciousness works, because there are only three aspects to consciousness. You have thoughts, emotions, and actions, and there's a reason for that, and we need to really dive in and understand the simplicity of that. This isn't very complex. This is really basic stuff. So even children can come to understand this, and I think we should be teaching our kids about these things very, very early on, and instead of waiting until you get to college or whatever. You should be teaching your kids, consciously parenting your kids with this kind of knowledge. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our final topic, though. It does correlate to the brain, and it correlates to all forms and physical manifestation. It is what is known as cymatics, which I briefly mentioned earlier. The definition of cymatics is the governing dynamic of forms. So cymatics is its frequency. So if you look it up, you're going to find where they take these particles, these granular solids, and they put them on a plate, a glass plate or some type of plate, and then they vibrate that plate. And depending on the actual hertz and the frequency that's vibrated through the particles or the granular solids, they will take different shapes and different forms. And a lot of times, actually, I think most of the time, they take sacred geometrical shapes. So this really correlates back to geometry in the Quadrivium when we understand that. And this is also about consciousness too, because that frequency is consciousness. So the reason why we see these biological forms taking shape this way, the reason why the brain is in three aspects, is because of cymatics. And there's these forms of sacred geometrical shapes that take hold within the mind, and we can even look at these as metaphysical forms that also take shape from frequencies also. So it's not just physical that it happens, it also happens metaphysically as well. But sacred geometry is a very beautiful thing and can be found in all the patterns of creation everywhere. And that means from our cells of our DNA, they hold sacred geometrical patterns. Snowflakes is a great one. The eyes have sacred geometrical patterns. Pine cones, flower petals, branches of trees, they all hold what is known as fractal patterns. And cymatics is the root of fractals as well. So fractal theory is something that is self-similar throughout scales. So I believe I said that correctly, but you can look that up. So fractals are very important when it comes to understanding cymatics. So cymatics is, like I said, the governing dynamic of form. So frequencies govern the way forms take shape in our physical world, and like I said before, in our metaphysical world. So if you're wondering why we see all these beautiful, gorgeous patterns in nature, from a sunflower to the dendritic patterns of lightning, which is branching patterns of lightning and things like that, it's because of the vibration underneath of that. And this study was pioneered by Dr. Hans Jenny, and they really started to bring this out in the early 1900s and really kind of revolutionized, later on in like the 1970s. And the word cymatics comes from Greek, and it's chi, and it's not with the C, it's with the K, because there are no C's in Greek. This is also where we get our word Cymatica from. So there's a great documentary about cymatics or Cymatica, and it's called Cymatica. So I would recommend looking into that documentary also. But it refers to matter relating to waves and how waves govern the particles within matter to take shape. And I could reiterate that over and over and over. But that's basically what it is. The cyclical nature and patterns, the intervals between the wave frequencies determine the way those shapes are formed in our minds and in physical reality. Now, make no mistake that the ancients did understand this science. So, in fact, it has been rediscovered and fine-tuned in the past decade. But if you look back to the 7 Hermetic principles, you will find that this science was well understood and utilized in the ancient cultures of our world. One example of this is ancient forms of chants and mantras and synchronization between people who are singing certain vibratory tones that harmonize together to amplify the effect. Music is a great place to look when we're trying to look for the effects of cymatics, and that there are patterns that take place, there are forms that take place when you look at the vibrations that are, being produced from musical expressions. And when they did a study, I think it was John Stuart Reid, who is an acoustical engineer in England, used cymatics and used the frequency of 432 hertz. He noticed that it created equilateral triangles. And I think that's very important because that's about balance. And we know that most music now is created with 440 hertz. And a little interesting history about 440 hertz. As early as 1885, the Music Commission of the Italian government declared that all instruments and orchestras should be using a tuning fork that vibrates at 440 hertz, which was different from the original standard of 435 hertz and the natural harmonics of 432 hertz used in France at the time. In 1917, the American Federation of Musicians endorsed the Italians, followed by a further push for 440 hertz in the 1940s. In 1953, a worldwide agreement was signed declaring that middle A on a piano be forevermore tuned to exactly 440 hertz. This frequency became the standard in the world for all musical instruments, based on the chromatic scale, the one most often used for music in the West. Now, a lot of people may be familiar with a lot of the mind control techniques that have come out from pop music and things like that, but 440 hertz is definitely part of that overarching plan. It is literally a war on consciousness, and this is because our natural vibratory tuning is 432. Now, I say that because 432 lines up with pi and the golden ratio, which also correlates to cymatics and fractal frequencies. So this affects our consciousness. This is literally a war through vibration on our consciousness. Furthermore, 432 hertz resonates with 8 hertz, the Schumann resonance of the planet, which is the electrical magnetic beat of the Earth. So this also tunes us back into Gaia or planet Earth. Now we know by studying history that frequencies have been used to agitate people's consciousness for a long time. The monopolization of the music industry features this imposed frequency that is herding populations into greater aggression, psychological agitation, and emotional distress, which also can directly affect the wellness and health of an individual's body because of the way that the cells are interacting and the way that the signals are interacting with the particles of the body. Going a little bit deeper, it is said that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels insisted that 440 hertz tuning in Germany because he believed it made people think and feel in a specific way, making them a prisoner of a certain type of consciousness. A lot of people try to debunk this because of the way that the music makes them feel personally, but they fail to understand the science of cymatics when it comes to this. And when you actually use 440 hertz, you can see the direct effects in granular solids, like I was talking about earlier, which makes them less orderly and more chaotic. And this happens within the biology of the being when we are submerged in that frequency constantly. And then just to add one more thing there, the equilateral triangles are integral to the flower of life, and it's integral to platonic solids. And platonic solids is something that we will talk about in the future because those are part of understanding cymatics and forms and archetypes and symbolism. And this is all just base information that one needs to have in their toolbox to really help not only themselves to come to an understanding about how this world works and how our internal workings work, but also to help enlighten other people who have not been educated into these. So we are water, and then we're also light, and light has to do with wave frequencies, and so does water. They're both really derive from a sacred feminine aspect of the universe. Now, obviously, light is mostly associated to the masculine aspects of the universe, and darkness, the feminine aspects. But what I mean here is the underlying wave frequency of light is associated to the feminine. All living things emit photons from their DNA, and this is something I found very profound. And these photons operate in the visible light spectrum from slightly off the infrared to the ultraviolet. And so DNA emits coherent light. And this is very similar to an extreme weak laser in a way when you're looking at the scans and stuff of that, when you're looking into the science of it. So, our DNA, the shape of our DNA takes place because of the frequency that's being emitted through that. And that's also because of the light, that's also being emitted not only from that, but also through that as well. So light has a big thing that plays into factor with cymatics. So sound is a sacred feminine component. So speaking is feminine. So yelling is feminine. Screaming, crying, having the emotions through the vocal cavity, and using this tool is a sacred feminine aspect because it has to do with wave frequencies. Now, I want to clarify on that the act of speaking is a masculine activity or associated to the masculine component, but the wave frequency that is being emitted is a feminine attribute. That's because of the curve. The curve makes it an archetypal feminine, whereas a straight line would be an archetypal masculine symbolic association. But if we take a look at some of our other senses, we can see that listening is feminine. Smelling is obviously feminine, like smelling flowers, right? We know that's a very feminine trait to our consciousness. And listening obviously is taking in wave frequencies. So this is about being receptive, which is a feminine attribute of our consciousness. But I think that's really important to understand that the right brain is a receptive aspect of consciousness, and the left brain is the logical and the reasoning part of that. And I wouldn't even say reason. I would say that true reason is the balance between the left and the right together. So the left brain is not just mainly reason. It's the unification of the left and right which makes reason happen, because you have to have critical thinking and critical feeling. You can't just have critical thinking. Well, we always hear about critical thinking, but we never hear about critical feeling. And critical feeling is a really important part of our aspects of consciousness. So that's all we have time for today, folks. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to coming back on and bringing up more of these crucial and informative topics, hopefully to spread this knowledge wide and far to many like-minded people. Make sure to check out our website, CubbyWhole.com. That's CubbyWhole, for all the current updates, news, blogs, and episodes of the podcast. I hope that you all have a wonderful day